Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. It's myself, Jackie Mensah, and my colleague,
Sarah Pennicott.
and we are the family team here at Bennett Griffin. Today, we're very lucky to have a guest come along to talk with us today about a big issue, parental alienation, which has been in the news quite a lot. And so our guest today is Cerys Sayer, who's at Westgate Chambers. Cerys, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about this really important topic.
Well, afternoon, and thank you for inviting me. It is, as you say, very much a hot topic. Keeps coming back into focus in the family law court very much.
Yeah, it is indeed. And Cerys, can I say, I think just as a starting point, obviously all of this is prefaced with the fact that the needs, the welfare of the child are absolutely paramount in accordance with the Children's Act, and just generally, as far as anybody's concerned, any experts or anyone involved in contact issues, the court process, that's what it's about, and that's absolutely up there at the top of everything, isn't it, in terms of considerations, and then everything else is flowing from that, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, from the family court's point of view, the tribunal, whoever your judge is, whether it's magistrates, to the highest judges in the land, the preoccupation, the prime concern of the court is the welfare of the child. And interestingly, and what feeds into obviously what we're talking today about in detail is the welfare of the child, but also the relationship of the child with the parents, and how the court goes about trying to promote that, because there is also underneath the priority of the child the importance for that child to have a relationship with their parents and indeed other family members as well. It doesn't always stop there with parents.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so in terms of your experience, obviously you've got a wealth of experience in terms of your work as a barrister, dealing with and looking after parents. What do you think is the most common aspect of parental alienation? Where does it appear most of all in the cases that you deal with?
I've got to say that there isn't, I could say to you, a classic case of parental alienation in terms of where I come across it in my practice. It's such a varied issue. I've acted for parents, fathers, mothers, and I can't say to you there's a typical case in which would give rise to parental alienation. It's very much, I would say, a phenomena that's probably always existed. We have family dynamics, some good, some bad. What we now have, because of the way that our society and our family structures have evolved, we have more often families which are separated rather than together. And therefore, in some cases, unfortunately, on the separation of the family, on the breakdown of the family, there can be a myriad of dynamics at play, which result in either actual alienation or suspicion and fear that there has been alienation. There can also be a number of reasons why that outcome or that reaction in the child is in fact, when I say justified, it is not in fact alienation by a parent intentionally or even subconsciously, but because of another justifiable reason.
Yeah. And I think many people might have seen the recent documentary with the mums fleeing out of the jurisdiction, but it's not purely an issue that's raised where there's domestic violence, is it? It can come from a whole host of reasons, and like you say, not necessarily the child has picked up on things sometimes, as opposed to things being directly said, and the alienation can come from there and get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Absolutely, and I think what you need to remember, following on from what I was just mentioning, and you touched upon it there, is and helpfully you can look, for example, on CAFCAS's website online, which the Child and Family Court Advisory Service, which is not related to social services, not related to the court in any way, they give an overview as to what that potential umbrella or spectrum of justifiable reasons could be. For example, you could have a case where there genuinely has been domestic abuse within the relationship. That doesn't mean to say that there isn't also alienation then as well, because things can come in tandem. But if a child has been exposed to and been in a home where there has been actual abuse, or even just acrimony, where there's been conflict, and they then feel either fearful of the parents being abusive, or, for example, they feel a natural inclination to try and align themselves with one parent through no fault of the other parent, because they emotionally feel unsafe and they feel a need to attach themselves. The resources from CAFCAS are very good in helping understand that there is this umbrella spectrum, if you like, where they call it the 4 A's. So you have obviously the alienation, but you have attachment, you have affiliation. But also, as I say, that there is also, unfortunately, the abuse as well, and the conflict. And looking at now, for example, the documentary, and it's setting out how, for example, in that, a mother who claims not to have been abusive, I think that's the very first example in the documentary. She says, well, in fact, he was abusive. I was then cross-alleged to be the alienator. I don't, again, think it's particularly a new phenomena that alienation is being utilised in that way, because we as practitioners are used to cross-allegations having been made. As soon as one person alleges perhaps that the other is the perpetrator, you are used to having to deal with an allegation of, well, they hit me, well, no, they hit me first, or they said this, I said that in response. So I would say it's an evolution of those cross allegations, which we've all been used to for quite some time. But as the court becomes more sophisticated at dealing with domestic abuse, the perpetrators being manipulative, as we know, unfortunately, they are. That's one of their key traits. They too have become more sophisticated at trying to play the system. And that's what you obviously see in the documentary, which spells out how dangerous it can be, because ultimately one of the ways of dealing with parental alienation, if it's been found, it is change of residence. And obviously that's why the first lady in that case fled, as I understand it, to Northern Cyprus.
Yes, and it often used to be viewed that a change of residence or transfer of a child's home was a last resort. But it seems also now that it's not necessarily, if it really is in the best interest of the child.
No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's set out in case law. I've got the case in front of me here, actually, without wanting to get too bogged down in legalese, but it was Thorpe L.J. who said that. McFarlane P. in the case of Riel, a child in 2019. And I've got a case that I had to, it's not my case, but one I had to deal with recently in the absence of a colleague at the last moment, at the stage where we're at pre-trial review hearing. So immediately prior to the final hearing, which there will be in that case, not a single fact find on its own, but a rolled up fact find and welfare hearing. And the other side were very clear and was putting my client on notice of the fact that that is the outcome they will seek if findings of abuse as are made in this case are not found. And the court was very much with the other side in that message being sent to my client. But interestingly, I would also say that we have to be careful with default findings. It's not so straightforward to simply say, well, because the abuse hasn't necessarily been found, therefore 2 and 2 must mean there has been alienation. We've got to put ourselves in the shoes of a parent where, for example, you might have a child coming home, could be a very young child, and they could say something happened, whether that's physical, whether it's sexual. I've had it in both instances with very young children. where it's very hard. It's going to be extremely hard factually to get to the bottom of what has gone on or not gone on. But as a parent, what you do, you have to ask yourselves, equally a parent might be criticised for not acting protectively and intervening. So it's a very, very difficult balancing exercise. And interestingly, the judge, although the judge, for example, at that PTR sent a very clear message, should, for example, alienation be a live factor in that case, they did equally recognise when I made submissions that we might need to have psychological assessment afterwards, because it could be, for example, simply that parent needs help and support to have the confidence to know that although the trust might have been lost in that previous relationship with that previous partner, that they can parent and they can trust that those allegations are not necessarily true. They've been born out of a misunderstanding. So it's a very, very difficult, concept and construct to have to deal with.
Yes, yeah. So I've had some cases whereby newly separated and there are allegations of parental alienation, but actually as we move on, the parties almost move on from that position and are able to start to work together more. And I know that's what the court would want, is for people to parent together. But as they move on, then the child needs to be helped to move on as well, because the child can become very entrenched back at the position where they're seeing the parent they live with so affected by the breakup that they become alienated by that as well. So that can end up then with an application to the court to help them move on as a family unit, with CAFCAS giving some support as it goes along as well, can't it, rather than always needing a fact-finding hearing.
Absolutely. And from my point of view, as counsel, as a barrister who's expected to go to court and represent people, it's a very difficult. I've been reading recent guidance that was published in August in advance of our meeting, and we know as practitioners that the wealth of guidance says when and how to identify whether a fact find is needed, the balance about necessity. And I've had cases where, a case in lockdown where, without giving away or saying too much about it, contact had been ongoing past separation for quite a while. And at first blush, it seemed like it was going to be a very easy case if we could just get contact back on track. And avoid the need for a fact find, because that had been the status quo for a number of years, and the allegations were very much historic. But because of the collateral damage caused by COVID and how long it took the case to progress, even though we got NIAS on board at only the second hearing it came about 10 months later. That we ended up having to backtrack and have a fact find because the perceived alienation became more and more entrenched as the proceedings went on. So I would certainly always advocate for very proactive engagement from obviously solicitors, and I'm not saying that to pass the buck, but you are the people who parents come to see first and foremost. I would certainly encourage to try and have roundtable meetings, put forward proposals. You will get a situation where perhaps the other party is absolutely opposed to contact, because as we know, again, contact could be perhaps drying up, or it could be sporadic. It may not be completely stopped, but one way or the other, you could potentially break that pattern by saying, even if it's agreeing to a set of circumstances that your client may not like, let's just say have supervised contact. Your client might say, well, I don't feel like it's necessary at this stage, but it's far better to not have a complete full stop and to be able to build up from something. And I have to say, again, from my point of view then as counsel, when you are in those hearings, when you are in, whether it's fact finding or final hearing, there is an analysis as to what the parties have done by trying to resolve matters at the outset. and correspondence between solicitors and attitudes taken at the outset. If, for example, somebody turns around and says, well, actually, I don't want to go to a contact centre because I shouldn't have to, that's not ideal. Parents, I have seen parents criticise that, even if arguably they should have been able to carry on having unsupervised contact. So very much at the beginning, as you're saying, try and avoid court and fact findings at all costs if you can, but equally, if the writing's on the wall, just get on an issue. Interim applications for contact again can be made at court, and there is no reason why, as long as contact is safe. Go back to what we said right at the outset about children being paramount, but another consideration soon after that is them having a relationship with both parents. If you can persuade the court, there's a way that contact can continue or become more meaningful and consistent. As long as it's safe, then that should be something that can happen in tandem, whatever case management ends up being necessary.
Yes, I think what you've touched on there as well is the importance of maintaining any kind of contact, even if it's not direct contact. For example, playing video games and things like that, where there is still some level of communication, because with the court system at the moment, there is such a delay in proceedings anyway. And if we're having to have fact-finding hearings because of the need to look at whether there have any allegations are proved, whether that's alienation or abuse, then maintaining that relationship has got to be helpful, hasn't it? Because starting from nothing after months and months is so difficult.
Absolutely. I mean, quite frankly, that is the most dangerous scenario if contact stopping altogether and not being able to in some way endeavour to build it up. Again, through COVID, as we all know, we had to come up with sometimes quite creative solutions. And I hadn't heard that one that you just said about playing video games, which, is brilliant because that's interactive as well as being indirect, and therefore, and probably also recordable now because of all of the various different settings that you can have. So, anything that I would say can be monitored, so that we have the box about safety ticked, but then also potentially providing evidence moving forward. So, for example, the positives of, for example, supervised contact would be that you would have notes from it if you paid for all that facility available. But similarly, a recorded video note now, similar to what this will look like once it's up and running, is where the child could be sent a short clip from the parent, particularly if it's a young child. That's something that, again, as practitioners, I didn't come across that very much before COVID, but that became quite a helpful vehicle for trying to be able to send something a bit more interactive, although still can be indirect. So we're not stuck with just the very traditional cards and letters, which can seem a little bit 2D and a little bit cold and removed for a child. And certainly play around those options, as you say, to just keep the contact going at some level and hopefully build it up.
Yes, yeah.
And there are sort of what some might feel are softer tools which can be used by the parents. They don't have to be directed by the court, do they? For instance, therapeutic input, and obviously people have to be receptive to that. But also so therapeutic, but also separated parenting courses as well. So just working on those skills as parents and building up the communication rather than it having to be cranked to a certain level within the court system. But obviously within the court system, the system has teeth for a reason. It's there when things do become intractable and do become so hostile. So, I mean, on that point, Cerys, what about the child having their own voice within the proceedings? I mean, where does that come into play? So if you've got sort of fact finding, so you've gone beyond the softer option, so to speak, but you're now in that zone.
Yeah. So what I would say is if you've played out those softer options, as you say, gone jump through those hoops, but unfortunately you're in a situation where you've had to issue. My recommendation would be to front load as much as you can in that initial application spell out that you want the child to have a voice, and what we mean by that as practitioners is that you therefore need to have on board, whether it is NIAS, which is a specialist advocacy organisation, which step in to very much do that. They effectively are acting on behalf of or representing the child, or perhaps even before that, you have CAFCAS, who could and do sometimes prepare a new wishes and feelings report. And if it's obviously very clear on your application that that is something that needs to be explored, if the case is rigorously as it should be triaged at the court when it goes through the safeguarding gatekeeping stages, that is something that the court can, of its own volition, be proactive and set up. So you may find yourself in a situation, if you've absolutely, as I say, front loaded everything that you possibly can in that initial application, find yourself that you're able to leapfrog into the first hearing with whether it's CAFCAS of the view that this parental alienation is an issue that they could even explore before the first hearing. I've had that on one occasion. Or, as I say, I mean, what I would do if I was a solicitor still is put in the full gamut. So you have the potential for the CAFCAS, which is the feelings at the outset. You question whether you need to have NIAS or Section 16(4) guardian, which, without going into too much legalese, they are all amounting to the same thing in the sense of being able to give that the child voice. Yes. As soon as possible. What you certainly want to avoid is it dragging on for months and months and months before everybody realises, oh, we need to have the child's voice heard, and you've wasted all of that time. And that's not a criticism of us as professionals, because sometimes it can be a situation where parental alienation only becomes more flagrant or even detectable as the case goes on, and that case that I discussed earlier on is an example of that, where the delays in COVID, unfortunately, were the foe rather than the friend of the people involved in that.
Yes. I think we've experienced that, haven't we, in our cases, in terms of delay. I mean, that's part of the problem, isn't it? Once you're within the court's remit, you have inevitably, even through the best of endeavours of everybody involved, all the professionals, you have delay, and that can work in either direction as far as parental alienation is concerned. Because also if you don't have the continuity or you don't have the momentum with the case, you can also lose some of the nuances and some of the history behind the case as to where those allegations have come from. And then often things are just exacerbated, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think going back to a point you raised in the opening to the last question, I think it's really important for, at that initial stage where you are trying to see if you can avoid proceedings or come to some sort of neglected human solution without the needs of the court. I think, as you said, SPIFFle, I think is now called Transforming Parents. It's got a new name, but the online courses, again, it's offered by CAFCAS, and I would certainly say that that's a good thing for parents to explore at the same time, to try and just see if they can at least open up their minds to being able to reach a resolution. And that's certainly something that we know in all litigation, the courts are obviously very eager to try and see if parents can resolve issues without having to end up before magistrates or a judge.
Yes, I wonder whether there's a public perception, which perhaps isn't helped by programmes like the BBC, that as soon as somebody's accused of parental alienation, that's going to be found and they're in some way going to be punished, when in fact the reality is that the court and us will look at the reasons behind why a child is saying that they don't want contact, and CAFCAS will look at those reasons and what steps need to be put in place. So it's not a case always of punishment is the first resort, and that it's definitely going to be found that there's parental alienation. And I think there is a concern that maybe there is a public perception of that if somebody alleges parental alienation, then they will definitely then be able to have contact and potentially change the residence.
I think that you're right. I think that in the media there is an element of scaremongering. I mean, watching that BBC documentary, it was hugely emotive. And there's a couple of articles as well, which will be easy to find. And I can sort of give you the dates and the names of the authors in The Guardian, which when I've given these talks over the years, at that point, those articles had just surfaced. And it's obviously really polarizing, because if you're not involved in the process, you don't realize how complex and how nuanced and how all-consuming it is for everybody involved, and how any decisions that are made are taken extremely carefully, and for good reason on times over a long period of time. But it's certainly not, as you say, as is sometimes built up to be, a knee-jerk reaction that if there is alienation, somebody's children are removed, and it all happens overnight, sort of with cloaks and daggers. It's certainly not like that. And of course, in terms of the many different number of outcomes, if alienation is found, what should happen then is that then experts are brought on board to work out what the options are, in order to hopefully help family heal in a holistic way. Because as I said earlier, if, for example, in that other case that allegations of abuse are not upheld, it doesn't automatically mean that the person's an alienator. It just might mean they need help and support, and that's where then psychological intervention can help, and therapy can also be identified as part of that, because it is a very multifaceted healing process. Everyone involved in that family dynamic, which is broken down in some way and gone wrong, needs help, but obviously from different angles for different reasons.
Yes, yeah. That's been really
Thank
helpful,
you.
and hopefully has helped to provide a bigger picture to people about the way it's approached by the court, and that it's not immediate, it's not a punitive system, it's about what is best for the children.
Absolutely, because people need to not feel frightened to come forward and say what is going on or how they feel in the best interest of their children. So hopefully this has helped in some way. It's an enormous issue, but we really appreciate that, Cerys. Thank you.
No, I think it's probably one that could, take days and weeks and months to discuss. And as I said at the beginning, it's very much, when I say a concept or a construct, it's really hard to even give it a label. There is no set legal definition for it. CAFCAS have arrived at varying evolutions of definitions. They've changed over the years. In the talks that I've given about it, I look back for this and can see how those have changed over time. And the very recent case of Cerys, an expert this year, the judge was very clear that it is a set of factual circumstances rather than a syndrome, because 20 odd years ago, people were looking at it from that point of view. And it's not said as a criticism, but it just goes to show what a difficult issue it is. But ultimately now, from the court's point of view, it's very much, if you like, a branch of emotional abuse. It is looked on as there has to be evidence factually that the court decides. It's the court's decision to make the finding as to whether that has happened, as perhaps the cross allegations, as I said, of whether it's physical or sexual abuse. And then ultimately, once those findings have been made, that's when they bring in the psychological experts. But thank you very much for your time as well. It's been quite interesting to hear your questions from the point of view as obviously solicitors who are dealing with people when they come in with their concerns.
Well, it's great working with you, and together we'll do our best for our clients always moving forward.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.